A strange kind of discomfort begins in moments that are supposed to feel good. Someone says something kind to you, not vague politeness, not flattery, something real. They notice a quality in you, a strength, a beauty, a talent, a presence. They say it sincerely, without demand, without manipulation, without trying to get anything from you. And instead of simply receiving it, something in you tightens. You smile. You say thank you. You may even respond in a way that sounds natural. But inwardly, the moment does not land as easily as it should. It catches somewhere, almost like your mind and body do not fully know what to do with it. This experience is often subtle enough that you might dismiss it at first. You may think you're just shy, not good at taking compliments, a little awkward with attention. But if you pay closer attention, you begin to notice that the discomfort has a pattern. It happens when someone sees something good in you too directly, when they name something valuable that you would rather leave undefined, when they reflect back an image of you that feels warmer, stronger, more beautiful, or more capable than the one you normally carry inside yourself. And in that moment, instead of feeling recognized, you feel exposed. That is what makes the experience so confusing. Praise should feel affirming. It should create warmth, relief, maybe even closeness. But for many people, it creates something else: embarrassment, tension, suspicion, a subtle urge to reduce the moment, deflect it, laugh it away, minimize what was said, or immediately shift attention elsewhere. You may know this feeling well. Someone compliments your work, and you instinctively explain why it was not really that difficult. Someone tells you that you look beautiful, and instead of taking it in, you respond with self-deprecation or discomfort. Someone admires your presence, your intelligence, your emotional depth, and rather than feeling seen, you feel almost cornered by it, not because the compliment is false. Sometimes the worst part is that it feels true enough to be unsettling. That is where the real tension begins. Because if the compliment were obviously empty, you could dismiss it without much consequence. But when it feels sincere, and when some part of you knows it is touching something real, the experience becomes harder to escape. Now, the issue is not whether the person means it. The issue is what happens inside you when the goodness they see collides with a version of yourself you're used to inhabiting. This often shows up in ordinary, everyday moments. A friend tells you that you carry yourself with strength. A co-worker says they admire the way you think. Someone close to you notices your kindness in a way that is more specific and direct than usual. And instead of feeling simply grateful, you feel an almost immediate urge to move the attention away. You may change the subject, return the compliment quickly so the focus no longer stays on you, make a joke, downplay it, or explain why they are exaggerating. The body often reacts before the mind fully understands why. A tightening in the chest, a little heat in the face, a sense of being too visible too fast. The moment feels larger than it should, and afterward, it may stay with you in a strange way, not because it made you feel good, but because it made you feel seen in a way you are not fully comfortable with. You may replay it later and notice how fast you tried to escape it, how little time you gave yourself to actually receive what was said, how quickly you moved into deflection, humor, humility, or denial. And that realization can be difficult, because it shows you that discomfort is not only connected to criticism. Sometimes it is connected even more deeply to admiration. This creates an interesting contradiction in the psyche. Part of you may long to be seen, to be recognized, to be valued accurately, to have someone notice the good in you without distortion. And yet, when that actually happens, another part of you reacts almost like it is under threat. That contradiction is painful because it is so easy to misunderstand. You may conclude that you are ungrateful, that you are emotionally blocked, that you do not know how to accept love or attention. All of that may contain some truth, but it does not yet explain the experience deeply enough. What you are feeling is not only awkwardness, it is pressure, because praise does more than make a positive statement. It confronts you with an image of yourself. And if that image is more whole, more luminous, or more valuable than the one your psyche is used to holding, the compliment can feel less like comfort and more like a disruption. You may begin to sense this in different forms. Sometimes praise feels too intimate. Someone's positive perception of you comes too close. too fast, and you instinctively pull back. Sometimes it feels unearned. You hear the compliment, but some part of you immediately begins looking for reasons it should not count. Sometimes it feels dangerous, not in a dramatic sense, but in the quieter sense that being positively seen creates vulnerability. If they see something that's good in me, what happens now? What do they expect? What if I disappoint them? What if I cannot maintain that image? What if they are wrong? What if they are right? That last question is often the most difficult one, because if the other person is right, then the compliment is not just a pleasant remark. It is a challenge to the old self-image. It asks you to include something in your identity that you may have kept at a distance for a very long time. Beauty, value, power, lovability, capability, presence, light. And many people are far less prepared to include those things than they imagine. It is often easier to accept being flawed than to accept being deeply good in a visible way. Flaws fit old narratives. They are familiar. They do not demand expansion. But goodness, especially when another person sees it clearly, can feel destabilizing. It asks you to inhabit more of yourself than you may be used to inhabiting. This is why some people are more comfortable with criticism than praise. Criticism hurts, but it lands in a place the psyche already knows how to organize around. Praise may not hurt in the same way, but it destabilizes the familiar structure. It introduces a version of you that you have not fully welcomed, a version that feels almost too bright, too open, too exposed. You may notice this especially if your identity has long been organized around modesty, struggle, invisibility, self-critique, emotional caution, or the need to earn your place slowly and carefully. In that case, praise can feel like too much too quickly, not because you do not want it, but because it touches a part of you that has not yet been safely integrated. That is why the emotional tone of these moments can be so strange. You want to be seen, but when you are seen in a beautiful way, you flinch. You long for recognition, but when it arrives, it feels difficult to hold. You crave real connection. But positive attention can make you feel more exposed and comforted. And once you begin noticing this pattern, you realize it is not random. It is part of something deeper. A hidden conflict between how you consciously experience yourself and what your psyche is ready or not ready to accept. That is where this journey begins. Not with self-esteem in the usual sense, not with generic confidence, but with a much more delicate question. Why does goodness feel so hard to receive when it is directed at you? To understand why praise can feel so uncomfortable, you have to look beneath the compliment itself. The words are usually not the real problem. What matters is what those words touch inside you. Carl Jung's psychology gives a precise way of understanding this. He did not view the personality as a simple, unified whole. He saw it as a dynamic relationship between conscious identity and the larger unconscious field that surrounds, influences, and often unsettles it. What you consciously know yourself to be is only one part of the picture. And for many people, the conscious self-image is much narrower than totality of what they actually are. This is where the tension begins. If your conscious identity has been built around self-doubt, modesty, emotional caution, or the habit of minimizing your own value, then praise does not simply feel pleasant. It introduces an image that exceeds the structure you're used to inhabiting. Someone reflects back strength where you feel only effort, beauty where you feel uncertainty, intelligence where you feel compensation, presence where you feel self-consciousness. And because the compliment presents a version of you that is larger or brighter than your established self-image, the psyche reacts defensively, not necessarily because the compliment is false, but because it does not fit cleanly into the internal system. This is why the moment feels like pressure. A positive statement about you has entered the field, but your identity has no easy place to put it. Jung would understand this partly through the relationship between the ego and what it can consciously tolerate. The ego, again, is the center of conscious identity. It holds together the sense of I. It organizes continuity, preference, self-description, and the psychological boundaries through which you experience yourself as a person. But the ego does not contain the whole personality. It only contains what has been admitted into consciousness and structured into identity. Everything else exists in less conscious forms. Some of it enters the shadow. And the shadow is not made only of what is dark, shameful, or destructive, This is one of Jung's most misunderstood insights. The shadow contains whatever the conscious self has not accepted. That includes not only anger, envy, selfishness, neediness, and fear. It also includes unlived strength, beauty, tenderness, giftedness, authority, vitality, and value. In other words, your positive qualities can remain shadowed just as much as your negative ones. This is crucial for understanding praise. If a quality has not been integrated into conscious identity, then hearing it named from the outside can feel as destabilizing as hearing an accusation, not because the content is negative, but because it forces contact with something you have not consciously made room for. For example, imagine that part of your adaptation to life involved becoming modest, careful, and self-reducing. Maybe this was rewarded in your family. Maybe it kept you safe socially. Maybe it protected you from envy, conflict, rejection, or exposure. Over time, not taking up too much space becomes part of your conscious identity. It feels moral, familiar, even necessary. Now someone says with genuine warmth, "You have a powerful presence." If that quality has not been integrated, the compliment lands in a forbidden zone. The psyche hears something like, "You are larger than you are allowed to be. You are more visible than your identity can tolerate. You carry something potent that your conscious self has not agreed to inhabit." That is why the reaction can feel almost like alarm. The compliment is not only flattering, it is disruptive. It threatens an established equilibrium. Jung would likely say that what is happening here is a confrontation with an unconscious aspect of the self. The compliment names something real. But because that reality has not yet been consciously integrated, it arrives from the outside in a form the ego cannot easily metabolize. The result is tension, embarrassment, deflection, even suspicion. This is also why some compliments feel more uncomfortable than others. A generic compliment may be easy enough to brush off, but a specific one, especially if it names something essential, can feel piercing. "You are beautiful" may feel manageable in some situations, but there is something deeply steady about you may strike much deeper. Why? Because specific praise bypasses the surface and touches the psyche where its unintegrated truth lives. And when unintegrated truth is recognized externally before it is consciously inhabited internally, the result can feel like exposure. This connects strongly to the persona as well. The persona is the social face, the adaptation through which you become acceptable, legible, and manageable in the world. Many people construct a persona around being easy to understand, non-threatening, unassuming, useful, intelligent but not too visible, warm but not too intense, competent but not too powerful. If praise begins naming qualities that exceed that persona, then the persona itself starts to feel challenged. Someone sees more than the role you are used to presenting. Someone sees through the adaptation. That can feel deeply uncomfortable, not because being seen is inherently bad, but because the usual social protection has been bypassed. A compliment, in that moment, becomes a form of contact with the self beneath the mask. And the psyche does not always welcome that contact immediately. There's another layer here that Jung would likely connect to complexes. A complex forms around emotionally charged themes: worth, visibility, love, shame, talent, desirability, power. When a complex is activated, the reaction is stronger than the immediate situation alone would justify. So if praise consistently triggers embarrassment, guilt, or the need to disappear, it may be because it is activating a worth complex, a visibility complex, a shame complex, or some combination of these. The compliment itself is small, but it touches a charged psychological network. That network may contain old associations, such as, "If I am seen, I will be judged. If I am admired, I will become a target. If I accept something good about myself, I become arrogant. If I allow myself to believe this, I will be humiliated later. If I take in praise, I risk disappointing others." These associations may not be fully conscious. You may not think these thoughts directly, but they can still shape the emotional reaction. This is why the body often reacts faster than the mind. You tense before you understand why. You deflect before you even decide to. The complex is already moving, and the compliment becomes the trigger. Jung's framework also helps explain why praise can feel morally dangerous to some people. If your identity has been built around humility in a defensive or distorted way, then receiving something positive about yourself can feel like moral contamination. The ego quietly equates self-acceptance with vanity. To let praise in would mean risking inflation. Jung absolutely warned about inflation, but this is where people often misunderstand him. Inflation is not the same as accepting one's value. Inflation is identification with greatness without relation to the whole psyche. It is a swollen ego mistaking itself for the self. But many people overcorrect in the opposite direction. They refuse positive reality out of fear that accepting it would make them arrogant, so they remain artificially small. In that state, praise becomes threatening because it seems to invite precisely what the ego fears: expansion. Yet the deeper psyche may not be inviting inflation at all. It may be inviting integration. The difference is decisive. Inflation says, I am grand, superior, exceptional, and above limitation. Integration says, this quality is real, and I must learn to include it without becoming possessed by it. That is much harder, much subtler, and much more mature. To receive praise well, you have to be able to hold positive truth without turning it either into denial or into grandiosity. Most people are trained in one of those two distortions. Either they reject the compliment completely, or they cling to it as proof of worth. Both responses reveal instability. What Jungian maturity asks for is something else: the ability to let the truth of something good touch you without collapsing your identity around it. That requires inner room, and many people do not yet have that room. So praise becomes too much. It touches shadow goodness, destabilizes persona, activates old complexes around shame and worth, and threatens the ego's familiar balance. Of course the psyche reacts. Of course it deflects. Of course it tries to restore the old, narrower self-image where things feel more manageable. The compliment then gets treated like an intrusion rather than a gift. This is why some people feel more regulated under criticism than under admiration. Criticism reinforces the old psychic arrangement. Praise challenges it. One confirms what the ego already expects. The other asks it to grow. Jung would not treat this as a superficial confidence issue. He would treat it as a confrontation with unlived selfhood. The discomfort means something in you is not yet free to know itself as it is being seen. And that is not a small matter. It means the question is no longer simply, why am I bad at receiving compliments? The deeper question becomes, what goodness in me has remained psychologically exiled, such that being seen in it feels more dangerous than being diminished? That is the real threshold. Because once you ask that, praise is no longer just a social event. It becomes a revelation, a mirror held up to the very parts of yourself you have not yet learned how to welcome. A different kind of work begins the moment you stop asking only how to get rid of the discomfort, because the discomfort itself is not the enemy. In many cases, it is the evidence that something true has been touched. That changes the whole task. If praise only made you uncomfortable because it was false, the solution would be simple: ignore it. But if praise unsettles you because it names something real that you have not yet learned how to hold, then the goal is no longer avoidance. The goal becomes capacity. The capacity to stay present when something good about you becomes visible. At first, that sounds easier than it is, because the reflex to deflect often happens before conscious thought. Someone says something warm and accurate, and immediately the old movements appear. You minimize, you joke, you redirect, you explain, you return the compliment too quickly. You make sure the spotlight does not remain on you long enough for anything to truly land. These are not random habits. They are protective gestures. They keep you from having to fully encounter what is being offered. So the first shift in integration is surprisingly small. You begin to notice the gesture before fully obeying it. Someone says something kind, and instead of instantly escaping, you feel the impulse to escape. That difference matters. Before, the pattern was invisible. Now it is observable. You feel the tightening in the chest, the heat in the face, the urge to reduce the moment, the quiet internal voice that says, move away from this. And instead of following that voice immediately, you stay with the sensation for 1 second longer than usual. Then maybe 2. This is where integration starts. Not by becoming perfectly comfortable all at once, but by interrupting the automatic refusal. Jung's psychology consistently points toward this kind of process. The unconscious is not transformed by force or by self-rejection. It changes when what was previously avoided becomes conscious enough to be endured, examined, and related to differently. So when praise arrives and the old discomfort rises, the new question is not, how do I make this go away? It becomes, what exactly feels dangerous here? That question opens a different kind of honesty. Maybe what feels dangerous is visibility. To be positively seen may feel like stepping into a light you have spent years avoiding. If your psyche learned that being visible invites envy, scrutiny, pressure, or eventual disappointment, then admiration does not feel neutral. It feels like exposure. Or perhaps what feels dangerous is expansion. To accept a compliment would mean accepting that you may be more than your old identity allows. More beautiful, more capable, more powerful, more lovable, more present. That expansion may sound good in theory, but psychologically it can feel like the loss of the old, familiar self. Sometimes what feels dangerous is expectation. If someone sees something wonderful in you, then perhaps you fear having to maintain it. To receive the compliment would then mean entering an invisible contract. Now that they see this goodness, you must continue to embody it perfectly. Better than to reject the compliment before it can become a demand. And for others, what feels dangerous is grief. Because if the compliment is true, then you may suddenly become aware of how long you have lived cut off from that part of yourself. The praise does not only reveal goodness. It reveals the years in which that goodness was neglected, hidden, denied, or exiled. In that sense, admiration can carry sadness with it. It illuminates not only what is present, but what has gone unlived for too long. This is why receiving praise, is far deeper than a social skill. It is a psychological act. It asks whether you are willing to remain in contact with a positive truth without collapsing into shame, denial, or inflation. That is subtle work. Because there is a real danger here, and Jung would not ignore it. If the ego receives praise without enough consciousness, it may grab onto it greedily. It may build a false identity around being special, gifted, beautiful, or exceptional. It may convert a moment of truth into a compensatory self-image. That is inflation. But if the ego cannot receive praise at all, it remains cut off from real aspects of the self. That is another distortion. So the task is not to reject a compliment or worship it. The task is to let it pass through you honestly. To neither shrink from it nor become possessed by it. That middle position is where maturity develops. You may begin to practice this in simple ways. Someone says, you have a strong presence. The old reflex says, laugh it off. The new movement says, pause. Let the words exist for a second without immediately correcting them. Notice what happens inside. Maybe there is resistance. Maybe there is embarrassment. Maybe there is disbelief. Let all of that be there. And then answer simply, thank you, not as a social script, as an experiment in letting reality touch you. This can feel almost shocking at first. A simple thank you, sincerely meant, can feel more exposing than a 10-minute deflection ever did. Why? Because deflection protects identity. Reception changes it. If you say thank you and actually allow the compliment to remain true for a moment, then some part of your old self-image has to loosen. The psyche must admit a little more light than it was previously structured to permit. That is why this work often unfolds slowly. You do not transform your relationship to praise in a weekend. You build tolerance for positive visibility over time. You learn that being seen in your goodness does not kill you. You learn that admiring eyes do not always mean danger. You learn that accepting reality about yourself is not vanity. And you begin to discover that there's a profound difference between receiving praise and depending on it. This distinction becomes increasingly important. At first, people who are uncomfortable with praise often assume the only alternative is to become someone who needs praise constantly. But these are not the only two options. Refusing positive reflection and becoming addicted to positive reflection are mirror images of the same instability. In both cases, the ego has not yet found proper relationship to value. One rejects it. The other clings to it. Integration does neither. It lets praise be information, not identity. A real compliment then becomes a mirror you can look into without moving to erase the image and without trying to live inside it permanently. This also changes your relationships. When you stop deflecting every positive perception, you allow a different kind of contact to happen. The other person's admiration no longer has to be managed instantly. Their experience of you can remain present in the space between you, and that can deepen intimacy in a much more honest way. Because one hidden cost of deflection is that it often protects you from being seen, but it also prevents a relationship from maturing. If every moment of positive recognition must be reduced, then the other person can never fully meet you in your goodness. They're allowed to approach your wounds, your limitations, your struggles perhaps, but not your real value. Over time, this creates distortion. People may feel warmth toward you, even love, but you remain secretly unavailable in one of the most important places. The place where you are beautiful, gifted, steady, radiant, capable, deeply real. Integration means becoming available there too. Not theatrically, not performatively, simply available. That may be one of the most vulnerable things you can do, because many people are far more practiced at exposing pain than exposing worth. Pain feels morally safe. Worth feels morally risky. Pain elicits care. Worth can evoke projection, envy, expectation, or expansion. To let your value be visible without apology is one of the quietest and deepest forms of self-acceptance. Jung's work points again and again toward this paradox. Wholeness includes both darkness and light. To become more whole is not merely to face the shameful or wounded parts. It is also to reclaim what was good but disowned, your warmth, your beauty, your authority, your creativity, your vitality, your capacity to affect others positively. If these remain disowned, you are not whole. You are merely humbler in a distorted way. And distorted humility is not true humility at all. It is often fear wearing moral language. True humility can receive the fact of goodness without needing to deny it or build a throne from it. That is what you are learning, maybe very slowly, maybe awkwardly, maybe one uncomfortable compliment at a time. But each time you resist the urge to disappear, something in the psyche changes. Each time you stay present with the heat of being seen and do not collapse into deflection, shame loses a little of its power. Each time you allow a positive truth to exist without reducing it, the old exile weakens. You start to become a place where the good can live consciously, not only in private, not only in theory, in relationship, in the world. And that changes the shape of the self, because you are no longer organized around keeping your light hidden from yourself. You are beginning, however modestly, to become someone who can survive being seen in it. That is what the integration of praise really asks. Not social ease, not polished confidence, something much deeper. Can you remain present in the face of your own visible worth? That is the threshold. And every time you stay, even briefly, you move a little further across it. What makes this experience so strange is that it reverses what most people expect. You assume the hard part of psychological life will be facing your flaws, your fear, your wounds, your anger, your envy, your shame, and all of that is difficult, of course. Carl Jung knew that deeply. He knew the work of confronting the shadow is painful, humbling, and often destabilizing. But there is another difficulty that people speak about far less. The difficulty of receiving something good about yourself without shrinking from it. That difficulty may be one of the most revealing things about you, because it shows that the problem is not only what you reject in yourself, it is also what you have never allowed yourself to include. If praise unsettles you, if admiration makes you tense, if a sincere compliment feels like pressure instead of comfort, it often means one simple but profound thing. Your psyche is not yet fully at home in its own goodness. That does not make you broken. It makes you divided. And division is exactly what Jung spent his life trying to help people understand. The goal was never perfection. It was wholeness. And wholeness does not only mean integrating what is dark. It also means integrating what is luminous. Your strength, your beauty, your tenderness, your intelligence, your presence, your impact, the very qualities you may have spent years reducing so that you can remain acceptable, safe, modest, manageable, or invisible. This is why praise can feel so confronting. It does not merely flatter you. It asks you to stop abandoning parts of yourself that may have been exiled for a very long time. That is not easy, because if you allow those parts back in, your whole identity may need to reorganize. You may need to stop calling humility what was actually fear. You may need to stop calling self-erasure what was actually goodness. You may need to stop pretending that staying small has been purely moral, when part it may have been protection against being seen too clearly. That is difficult truth, but it is freeing truth, because once you begin to see the pattern, you no longer have to keep repeating it automatically. You can notice the moment the compliment lands. You can notice the reflex to deflect, to joke, to minimize, to step aside from your own reality. And instead of disappearing the way you always have, you can stay, maybe only for a second, maybe only long enough to say thank you without apology. But even that matters, because every time you remain present in the face of something good being seen in you, you weaken the old bond between worth and danger. And slowly, something new becomes possible. Not vanity, not inflation, not dependence on praise. Something much quieter and much more stable than that. The ability to let goodness be real without being afraid of it. Before we close, take a moment and think of the last compliment that truly unsettled you. Not the empty ones. The one that felt sincere. The one that stayed with you. What exactly made it uncomfortable? Was it the attention? The vulnerability? The fear of expectation? Or was it the possibility that the person saw something in you that you are still not ready to claim? Stay with that question, because the answer reveals more than your relationship to praise. It reveals your relationship to yourself. If this resonates, write in the comments the kind of compliment that is hardest for you to receive. Not to analyze it perfectly, just to name it honestly. That honesty alone can reveal where your own light has been hardest to trust. And if you know someone who always laughs off compliments, minimizes praise, or gets strangely uncomfortable when something beautiful is seen in them, share this video with them. Because sometimes the deepest wound is not only in how we carry our pain, it is in how little room we have made for our own visible worth.